How did a young man named Ryan Speedo Green rise from an abusive, small-town childhood in Virginia to take the stage at the Metropolitan Opera? Author Daniel Bergner is here to talk about his new book, Sing for Your Life, a story of race, music, and family.
Life was so difficult for him when he was young, and he had to so rely on himself. It's like there's nothing that can crush him.
What is it that makes Maria Semple's Seattle novels so funny, so perfectly satirical, and so true to life? Maria is here to talk about her latest book, Today Will Be Different.
It came from really just, I sat down on the first day I decided I needed to write my new novel, and I sat down and I thought, what is going on? What is a part of myself that I don't want anyone to see?
We'll also talk literary news and what we and other people are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Even if you're not an opera fan, it's hard not to be moved by the voice of Ryan Speedo Green, who recently made his debut at the Metropolitan Opera here in New York, playing the role of Colleen, a poor philosopher in La Boheme. But Green's path to the stage of the Met is one of the most improbable of anyone who's ever sung there, as author Daniel Bergner lays out in his new book, Sing for Your Life, a story of race, music, and family. Daniel, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
Tell me a little bit about the subject of your book, Ryan Speedo Green.
Ryan Speedo Green grew up in an area of southeastern Virginia that rarely produces opera singers. He grew up in a trailer park. He grew up across the street from a drug dealer's ramshackle headquarters. He spent time locked up as a juvenile. But here he is singing at the Metropolitan Opera in a lead role in La Boheme. It's just this spectacular transformation.
How did this happen?
It happened through a couple of very, very inspiring teachers. And ultimately, I think it happened through Ryan's sheer will. And so when I first met him, when he was competing in the Metropolitan Opera's annual contest to find the most promising singers in America, and this was back in 2011, and when I first got to hear some of his story, I was just bowled over. I couldn't believe the transpiration. I couldn't glimpse the past within him, and yet I traveled back into that past with him, with his mom, going to the facility where he was locked up. And so the whole story, in a way, the whole book was an attempt to answer that question of how you get from there to here.
What's the answer?
If there were one single answer, I don't think it would be a book worth writing. When Ryan got out of the facility, and it was really a torment. I mean, he was taken off by cops in not only cuffs, but shackles, driven all the way across the state. He spent a lot of time in seclusion cells at the facility.
This was at the insistence of his mother.
This was because he had a very volatile and violent relationship with his mother. Both he and his brother did. And he threatened his mother's life. As a 12-year-old, she called the cops. They drive him across the state in leg shackles. He's full of rage at this facility. He's spent time in seclusion. We actually went back there. I went back there a few times by myself and then with Ryan. And I remember him standing in one of those seclusion cells, just touching the walls, sort of communing with this element of his past where he was utterly, utterly, utterly alone. He gets out of the facility and he's just so determined to change his life. He doesn't know how. His mom's living in a trailer park at that time. The first thing he does at school is join the Latin club, of all things.
Why?
Believe me, he was no star student because, as he put it, I wanted to be so far away from what I'd been and who I'd been spending my time with, and I just found the nerdiest people led by the nerdiest teacher I could locate. And, you know, I talked to his teacher, and he said, Ryan wasn't the best contestant at those Latin club duel-offs that they had, but he was certainly the most avid participant. So that was the beginning. By sheer luck, really, he found his way to the School of the Arts in Virginia. He was nearly tossed out after the first year, but then he found one of these teachers, Mr. Brown, an African-American singer, took him under wing, and long story, but here we are.
How did you get involved in this story? Because you've reported from Sierra Leone, you've written 2 books about sex, you write for the New York Times Magazine. How did you end up at those tryouts at the Met?
There's a lot of serendipity in Ryan's life and a little bit in how I found my way to him. My daughter was about to enroll in a conservatory as an undergraduate as an opera singer. She's long since decided she doesn't quite have Ryan-level talent and moved on. But I wanted to learn something about opera. I went to cover the Metropolitan Opera's annual contest for the New York Times Magazine. I reached out to all the semifinalists by email, asked them all to write me something about their lives. All but one of them wrote me back. Of course, they wanted to get a jump on getting covered in the New York Times Magazine. That one silent person was Ryan Speedo Green. He really didn't think he had a story to offer. He didn't think he had a voice to be heard. He was sure he wasn't going to make the finals, which are a formal tuxedo-required concert. He didn't even bring a tuxedo to New York. But I finally did spend a little time with him, and that made me want to spend what became, the last 5 years.
So when you didn't get an answer from him, you sort of pursued him and said, What's your story? The
funny thing was, Pamela, is that no insider was saying you should pay attention to Ryan Speedo Green. He may win. If anyone's going to go on to a career, it might well be him. No one said that. So actually, no, I didn't seek him out right away. I heard him sing somewhere along the days leading up to the semifinals, and there were 2 things that were really striking. One, he really, even then, before the years of training that have happened since, he had a wonderful, rich, lustrous voice. So that was striking right away. I said to him, let's spend 45 minutes over lunch. That became a 3-hour conversation. And I learned something, which was that he hadn't seen his father much at all growing up, but he had, in those days leading up to the semifinals, reached his father by phone across the country in California. And his father had promised Ryan that if he made the finals, he would come hear him sing opera for the first time. And that's a story that's hard to resist. So
you pitched this story to your editor at the magazine. What did you say? What was the hook? Because you didn't know how it would end up. I didn't at all. And originally, it wasn't a story about Ryan. I actually started covering the Met contest from the district rounds, which happen all over the country, sometimes in fairly obscure places. So I was just following this contest, and then my path converged with Ryan's. The other thing I should say is, as that 45-minute lunch became a 3-hour and a 3-day and then a several years-long conversation, is we were able to have these intense, very candid, open, complicated conversations about race. And I realized almost right away that this was going to be a special lens on race in America. Nowadays, so much of the way we cover race, and particularly maybe the way we cover young black men, is through the lens of cell phone videos, haunting cell phone videos of police shootings. And sometimes I think about this story now, and it's just a completely alternate lens. I mean, Ryan has been through all of that. I mean, he has had it extraordinarily difficult growing up, but this is also a lens about his sheer will, his attempt to connect across racial divides, his attempt, and I think he'd put it almost just this way, his attempt to sing so powerfully that color becomes invisible, that it's all about what we're hearing. When he started to sing, and I don't know if he grew up singing, how does he describe that experience for himself? So I think when we hear a story of a black kid going through all the difficulties he did, violent home, no father, locked up, and then we hear opera singer, a lot of us are going to assume, he must have sung in the church choir. We need to get rid of that stereotypical assumption. He did not sing in the church choir. What actually happened was he was playing football. His football coach said, why don't you take chorus for an easy credit? He did, showed no particular promise. He got it in his head that his chorus teacher insisted that to get credit, he would need to audition for this Governor's School for the Arts. So he did, singing the Star Spangled Banner.
He'd had one teacher when he was younger, before he got locked up, Mrs. Hughes, who'd really refused to give up on him, taught him the famous lines from the Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream" speech, which he still clings to and refers to this day. It didn't change him right away, but she remained in his life, called him at the facility, and her husband then became the head of this School for the Arts. And I think he put his fingers a little bit on the scales. Thus Ryan gets in, and raw though he was, he did not even know how to read music. Then enter Mr. Brown, this African-American opera teacher who takes him under wing, takes him on a school trip to the Met, where he sees Denise Graves, who's a very famous African-American mezzo-soprano. He's now 15 years old or thereabouts. She gives him a hug backstage, and he decides, this is what I'm going to do.
Let's pause for a minute and listen to that voice from the current Met production of La Bohème, where he plays Colleen. You and I were both at opening night last week. Describe that experience.
That was such a thrill. First of all, for me, I mean, Ryan and I have become so close. As his fourth act big moment aria approached, I was definitely holding my breath. He sang wonderfully. The New York Times Reviewer the next morning called it a showstopper. Denise Graves actually was there, so kind of full, circle on that scene from when he was 15 and came backstage. That was so moving.
I'm one of his
Ryan.
teachers.
Mrs. Hughes, his teacher from childhood, who I should stress, I mean, this is an extraordinary woman. She's tiny. She was given a special classroom for the 6 or 7 least controllable kids in the entire school district, of whom Ryan was one. And that was a bond between them that was forged then and remains now.
What was it like after the show was over and you saw Ryan?
When you asked what's the secret to his transformation, part of it is just, I think life was so difficult for him when he was young, and he had to so rely on himself that it's like there's nothing that can crush him. I've watched him in coaching sessions in the Met just be torn apart. I mean, your languages are terrible, your rhythm is terrible. I've watched conductors just literally stop him mid-rehearsal in front of everyone. But nothing will stop Ryan. So that moment was just a sort of thrilling climax to all that had come before.
You can kind of see it a little bit in the photo of him that's on the cover of the book, a childhood photo where he just has this kind of smile on his face and an optimistic kind of gleam.
I know. It's really magical because things at that moment were not at all gleaming in his life. And I think my challenge in writing the book was to capture that radiance, but also to be able to capture the depths of what he was, swimming up from as a kid.
Well, the title is very apt. Sing for Your Life, A Story of Race, Music, and Family by Daniel Bergner. Dan, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
Alexandra Alter is here now to talk about what's going on in the book world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
Well, we're not going to talk about books. We're going to talk about movies instead, right?
Yeah, I thought I'd change it up today.
All right. What's going on with movies about books?
There are a lot of interesting movies without books hitting theaters this fall. This weekend, The Girl on the Train is opening, and of course, everyone's familiar with that book. It sold more than 6 million copies in the U.S. alone. It became an overnight sensation. What's interesting about the film is how quickly it's come out. This is less than 2 years after the book was published, and usually these things have a much longer gestation time. But in this case, the producer and the screenwriter and everyone involved felt like they had this sensation on their hands. They really wanted to capitalize on the popularity of the book, which has not fallen off the bestseller list. So they immediately got it into production, and they got, the blessing of the author Paula Hawkins to change the setting from London to New York.
Why did they do that?
I thought it was a strange choice. It's not like Americans can't relate to living in suburban London, but apparently they wanted to appeal to the large United States audience for the book. Was one of the reasons.
We have trouble with those accents.
I know, it's hard to understand them.
Meanwhile, everyone in the movie is like British, or at least Emily Blunt is.
Exactly. But the other tricky thing about this adaptation, first of all, you have this completely adoring audience of the book, and that's always hard to appease those kinds of fans. Second of all, you have a novel that's really based on 3 unreliable narrators, and it's a very twisty plot. So when people know what's going to happen, is it going to be as much of a thrill? But capturing those different perspectives, I think, was hard. And you saw some of the first reviews of the film coming out saying, well, they had to rely on voiceovers and really intense close-ups. So I think something will possibly be lost in that. But we'll see. I mean, people are expecting this to be as big a hit as Gone Girl in the theaters, so that could be quite big. I just wanted to mention one review from our paper, Manila Dargis. She said that Girl on the Train is a preposterous movie, but not an unenjoyable one.
I love preposterous and not unenjoyable.
Sounds like a good
I'm
combination.
on board. All right, what else do we have?
We have an extraordinary-looking film from Ang Lee based on Ben Fountain's novel, Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk. I loved that novel, and I was excited to hear that Ang Lee was taking it on, but the way he's shot it is like sort of the way you would shoot a big blockbuster. It's in 3D. He's using an extremely fast frames per second, faster than anyone has ever tried before. So it's going to look hyper-realistic. And I just think that's an interesting choice for kind of a literary novel. It is a war novel. I mean, there's flashbacks to action in Iraq and things like that. The rest of the story takes place in a football stadium where the hero is being celebrated for his, heroism in war.
They have a very striking trailer that is primarily in that stadium.
Yes, the trailer is interesting. So I'm just curious to see how a big blockbuster kind of treatment of a more literary novel is going to play. Of course, Ang Lee has done this before with The Life of Pi, which was considered a very successful movie. So that'll be interesting to see how people respond to that. That movie is opening here in November. And a final movie that's out now based on another bestseller that is on our list and has been for a long time is a Swedish film called A Man Called Ove, I believe it's pronounced. I thought it was Ove. It's based on the novel by Fredrik Backman, which came out in Sweden in 2012, was released here in English 2 years later, and has now sold close to 1 million copies here. And nobody was really expecting this novel to take off in that way. I think they'd printed just 5,000 copies for their initial run. It's a novel about an older man who's a widow and who's extremely cranky and who's preparing to kill himself. You know this from the first page. And yet somehow it became a word-of-mouth sensation. Independent stores really got behind it. And now Sweden has submitted it as their best foreign film for this year's Academy Awards.
All right, well, it is the literary movie season.
But full disclosure, I have seen none of these movies.
But you have read the books.
That's true.
All right, you're ahead of many people. Alexandra, thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone loved Maria Semple's last novel, Where'd You Go, Bernadette? Maria is back now with her third novel, Today Will Be Different. I'm so happy to have Maria here to talk about it. Hi, Maria.
Thank you, Pamela.
And I'm going to distract you now by asking you to tell us just a little bit about your first and your second novels.
So my first novel is called This One Is Mine, and it took place in L.A., and it was about a woman who was my age who had a kid my age who had all the components of happiness, and yet she wasn't happy. Where'd You Go, Bernadette is about a woman my age with a kid my age who had all the components for happiness yet wasn't happy. And so,
But this time was in Seattle.
Yes, it was in Seattle where I happen to be living. And so now I seem to be treading the same ground, happily.
All right, so now we'll talk about your third book, Today Will Be Different, which is such a great title. Where did it come from?
It came from really just, I sat down on the first day, I decided I needed to write my new novel, and I sat down and I thought, what is going on? What is a part of myself that I don't want anyone to see, that I feel really bad about? And I just started writing on a yellow pad, and the first line that came out was, "Today will be different." And it was because I think I constantly struggle with feeling like I have all the components for happiness. It's a long struggle, and yet I go through the day not loving the people around me as well as I want to.
I love that idea of having all the components of happiness, if only you did everything a little bit differently.
Yes.
Will you read that opening just because it's so great?
Thank you. Today will be different. Today I will be present. Today, anyone I speak to, I will look them in the eye and listen deeply. Today I'll play a board game with Timby. I'll initiate sex with Joe. Today I will take pride in my appearance. I'll shower, get dressed in proper clothes, and change into yoga clothes only for yoga, which today I will actually attend. Today I won't swear. I won't talk about money. Today there will be an ease about me. My face will be relaxed, its resting place a smile. Today I will radiate calm. Kindness and self-control will abound. Today I will buy local. Today I will be my best self, the person I'm capable of being. Today will be different.
Okay, that just describes the thought process of 88% of the women that I know in the morning. I think my favorite line is, "Today there will be an ease about me." Just that, the poignancy of that idea.
Yes, and I always hear descriptions of people where they say, when you're talking to her, she's looking right at you. It's like you're the only person in the room. And I really want to be someone who gets described that way, but I don't think anyone has ever described me that way. But that's something I aspire to, is just to seem very relaxed and at ease in my personal interactions.
Right. There's that French expression like bien dans sa peau, like good in her skin.
Yes.
You know? When you wrote that, did you know what the rest of the story would be?
I seem to have backed myself into the corner of writing a book that took place in a day, which I certainly didn't think that I wanted to do. But the book kind of has to tell you what it is as you write it. It's talking back to you. So I thought, oh, here I go. I'm writing a book that takes place in a day. And I really care about story. I really want a propulsive novel. And so I got scared that how can I possibly achieve a page turner and an exciting experience for the reader when it's going to only take place in one day. And from that first page that I wrote, really what is an ordinary day.
Was that hard to work within those confines, or was that oddly relaxing and sort of simplifying?
It was simplifying. It was almost like going to the eye doctor and they go 1, 2, 1, 2, which lens is right. And once I kind of settled in on what the lens was, how microscopic I would be looking at everything, then I could settle into it and realize I wasn't just jumping ahead several hours, which of course you can do in other novels, or years even, that I just thought I'll just kind of follow the micro transactions of the day.
So I'm a big believer in avoiding spoilers, so I won't take you through all 24 hours. But why don't you just tell us about the first few hours? What is the premise of the book, and what happens during the beginning of that day?
Eleanor Flood wakes up having set this bar comically low for herself, which all she wants to do is get dressed, basically, and be present for her family. It starts off okay, maybe for the first 10 minutes of the day. She has a good interaction with someone out on the street, and she's feeling pretty good about herself. She asks him how his day was, and she looks him in the eye, and she thinks, hey, I can do this. But then very quickly things go off the rails. She goes into her kitchen after she walks the dog, and she sees that her husband is face down at the dining room table. And he's obviously very upset about something, and it's
I thought you were going to say he's obviously dead.
Right. No, he's breathing. But it's a jarring image for her because he really has it together and he's kind of her rock. And so by the time she takes the leash off the dog and closes the front door and she turns up and he's walked away from the table. And so her attitude about that is, hey, works for me. I guess he doesn't want to talk about it, I don't have to listen. And so that ends up coming back throughout the course of the day. And another early disaster talking to a mother, which you certainly don't have to admit this would be a disaster to you, but it's when you've dropped your kids off at school and then you get the phone call an hour later that your kid is sick and you have to come and pick up the kid.
Yes.
And so that to me is enough to make it a horrible day, just because is one of the joys of her day is to be alone for the chunk of time in the middle of the day. And so now that's been taken from her. And where she thought she would just have a day to herself, now she has her son tagging along with her. And so he becomes her sidekick. And they're, I think, a good comedy team.
You wrote for TV first.
I did.
Tell us about your TV writing.
I wrote for a lot of shows. It was comedies mostly. It was Arrested Development, Mad About You, Ellen. And I really loved it. I loved being in a room with a bunch of really funny people, and you really spend 80% of your time just trying to crack each other up and not writing the script. So you're always just going off on these crazy tangents that are just rude and totally unfilmable and unprintable, but you're just having the best time ever. And then it's like, hey, everyone settle down. We got to get back to writing the script. And so it couldn't be more fun. And I loved all the people I was with. And I think Mike Nichols said comedy is seduction or something like that, where it just brings out a really good part of me and I think of people to try to get other people to laugh.
Do you miss that collaborative process, instead of being alone in your room with a laptop or whatever it is?
Well, I thought that I would, and what I realized is I think that I'm an introvert disguised as an extrovert. I think that I like I can do the camaraderie, but it does actually fill me with anxiety. I don't think it's really my nature. Being alone, I really like. I'm kind of a queen about my own time. I really want to be in charge of my own time, and I'm prickly about it. And in TV writing, you really are going along someone else's schedule. And so you want to write, but there's not enough people in the room because some people are casting or at editing, or you haven't gotten notes back because an actor has taken a long time at sushi and has not come back to you with the rewrite notes or whatever it is. You're just kind of sitting around a lot. And if I'm sitting around, I would actually rather be napping. And you can't really do that on a comedy show.
This has always been around, this fact, but I feel like it's intensified recently, which is all the novelists really want to write for TV, probably because that way they could make some money. And all the TV writers now want to write novels. And so you're seeing a lot of novels coming out of these writer rooms. And I just wonder if does that seem like a natural kind of back and forth to you? Do you feel like you learned something from the TV writing process that you brought to your novels?
Very much so. I think I wouldn't be the writer I am without all my TV work, because all you do in TV is you're just working on story. It's just story, story, story. I was always the one at the whiteboard with the pen. And on my first job, I was kind of forced to do it as punishment because I turned in a bad script. And I think they didn't. I think they probably would have fired me if they could have, but instead they just said, okay, Maria has to stand at the board with the pen. And I would write all the story beats. And in fact, even as my career went on and I was running shows, I always made sure that I was the person at the board with the pen, because I just really get into story and just trimming the stuff that you don't need and making sure, is this really a scene? Is enough happening? And I really love always returning my focus to story. And so I totally bring that to novel writing. I don't know what kind of novels I would write without that. I don't think that I would be a novelist. And I think that's to the extent that my novels are distinct from other people's novels. I really think it's because of this kind of overdeveloped story muscle that I created. And at the same time, I do think that there's a complexity to novel writing. There has to be, with characters. And I can see why, especially now in the age of this binge watching and the Netflix and the dramas, where there's more room and more appetite for that kind of complexity and nuance, for characters that I think that they
interior
liked.
Voice.
Right. That novelists, I can see why would be very valuable in a TV setting now.
So now you're alone in a room and you're writing this novel. Today will be different. Do you find yourself going through the same processes in a way, but just by yourself? Like, okay, if this happens, then maybe that could happen, and sort of playing out those scenes and constructing them in that way?
Very much so. I think that I really do approach this as I would anything really I was writing at this point, because I do like stories so much, and I want to make sure that it's what I'm writing is on solid ground. I would say, if I and you know it, if you're writing a scene that shouldn't really be a scene, if there's not enough happening, or someone doesn't have a strong enough point of view, or if there's not a desire in a scene, or if it's just it just starts to feel soggy, when you're writing it, and you don't know what. The way I put it is, what am I writing towards? Like what's the point here? And if you're even starting to ask that, you realize you're on shaky story ground, that either this should be cut, that you need another element in it, that you just haven't gone into it clearly enough. You haven't had the characters have a strong enough point of view of what's supposed to be happening in the scene, so then you can upend it, and that is how I approach everything. And in the same way, sometimes I'll just come up with a really funny, weird line in the course of it, and I think, okay, that's going to be a line of dialogue, that'll be just a line of dialogue I put in. I think I write dialogue very leanly, and that's just from my time in a rewrite room. I think that comes naturally to me. I do actually, I must say, read a lot of novels where, man, it's good I don't have a red pen in my hand, because I would just cut 90% of the dialogue.
Right. All right. Well, then give us a parting gift here of reading a little bit of that very lean dialogue, one of those weird little funny lines.
So I'm going to read a little exchange. This is a little dialogue exchange between our heroine Eleanor and her brother-in-law, a guy named Bucky, who is a Southern Gothic, let's call him, an eccentric.
That's such a terrifying name.
He's a terrifying guy. He's from a very high-class New Orleans family, one of the good old families. And she is really horrified by Bucky and his house. He lives in the carriage house of his parents' house. And I'll start reading. Eleanor stood in the living room facing the window treatments. Valance, curtains, swag, Roman shade, and blackout roller. 5 separate things. 6 if you counted the silk tassels. Bucky came by sipping a screwdriver and joined Eleanor at the window. Maroon and ivory is my favorite color story, he explained. Color story? Eleanor said, snapping out of her trance. 1 is a color, Bucky said. 2 or more is a color story. Surely you know that. And he left.
Oh my God. That is so obnoxious. Did you overhear someone talking about a color story, or did you just make that up? Because it's so believable.
I was talking to someone who is really into clothes, and we were in a store. There was this dress that was navy and orange, and she said, "I love that color story." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Oh," she said, "Yeah, a color story. That's just more than one color." And looked at me like, duh. And I just thought I thought it was a really funny thing for someone to put someone in their place by not knowing the difference between a color and a color story.
I'm gonna have to roll that one out, I have to tell you, and just see if people find it completely obnoxious or if they think I'm being serious or what.
Okay, good luck with that.
All right, Maria, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was Maria Semple, author of Today Will Be Different. John Williams and Greg Coles join us now to talk about what we're reading. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela. Hi, Pamela.
I should say what they're reading, because I'm not really going to talk about what I'm reading. I'm still reading what I was reading the last time. I'm getting embarrassed. I'm on the last few pages of Leigh Bardugo's book, which I will say debuted at #1 on our young adult bestseller list this week. So I'm clearly not alone being caught up in this sequel. John, you're probably reading much more literary things.
I guess. I'm reading something that falls into the category that I credit you with inventing, which is called the obit read, because last summer this writer named Theodore Wiesner died. I had never heard of him, and Bruce Weber wrote his obit for the Times, and it was clear from the obit that the reason he thought he was worthy of mention was really this one book called The Car Thief, a novel that was first published in 1972, and it's a coming-of-age story about a kid who had stolen, I think, 14 cars by the time he was 16 years old. He's outside of Detroit. He's put into the kind of juvenile justice system, and it was slightly autobiographical. He called it a forgotten gem. It was reissued in the 80s by Vintage Contemporaries, which have these great covers, and that's the version I have, which I love.
Oh my God, I wish people could see this, because it looks like it came from the era of Bret Easton Ellis.
It very much did. Yeah. The Richard Ford, the sports writer, all these books that they were putting out at the time, Bright Lights, Big City. And so
you gotta Google image this, people.
I will. Well, I'll put it up on Twitter too. It just sounded right up my alley, and I'm about halfway through with it, and I'd say it's maybe one alley over. It's not quite where I wanted it to be, but it's very good. And it's about this teenage boy who I think, like Wiesner, was raised by his father. Wiesner's mother abandoned him when he was young, and then he was raised, I think, mostly in a foster home, but went on to obviously live a creative and full life, and went to Iowa and got an MFA there, so was a very accomplished writer. And so the boy in the book is dealing with the fallout of his emotional relationship with his father, and his father is visiting him in this juvenile detention center. And so I think the book's going to progress, and I'm eager to find out what happens to this kid. In researching this, I came up with this incredible letter that Wiesner wrote to the book review in 1987 when we reviewed another novel of his called The True Detective. And I just want to read it because it's kind of heartbreaking. He says, "To the editor, I'm sure you receive many letters of dismay and complaint over book reviews, and of course nothing is perfect. Still, how can I tell you how deeply you have hurt me by publishing Jonathan Coleman's review of my new novel? The degree of unfairness is what is so extreme, or believe me, I would not be sitting here feeling as if I have witnessed the very authorities commit a terrible crime. The book in question is one I worked on for more than 5 years, and it came alive, and it does work. It is relevant, and it is compelling. Yet you chose to give it a short review, inconspicuously placed, and I just cannot deal with this. Your reviewer did not even understand what he read. I repeat, your reviewer did not even understand what he read. You break my heart. You owe me much more than an apology. Theodore Wiesner, Pittsburgh."
It's like a knife to the heart. I wasn't responsible for that one. But
No, I was 13 years old at the time, so I wasn't responsible either. Greg, what are you reading?
One is a book that John actually reviewed for the newly released column a couple of months ago, I guess. It's the Joy Williams book, 99 Stories of God. It's a very short book filled with very short stories. There are truly 99 of them. They come numbered, and then the titles appear at the end of each little story, kind of like a punchline. You read along, try to figure out what the title might be, and then boom, she tells it to you. And these are all like little fables or anecdotes, vignettes that sometimes very indirectly reflect on the divine or the ineffable. It's kind of her concepts of how God might be present in the world, but not God in the way that anybody might think of it. The other book that I'm reading is a book that doesn't come out until February, and I don't think that I'm even the assigning editor on this one, but a galley landed on my desk, and I've been dipping into it with great enjoyment. It's by the poet and essayist Sarah Manguso, whose last book, Ongoingness, was a book about her diary that she's kept. It was not, in fact, her published diary. It was just a book about keeping a diary. She's also written about her problems with kind of chronic pain, various health issues that she's had. She's a lovely writer, and this book is called 300 Arguments. It comes out in February, and like 99 Stories of God, the 300 Arguments are 300 very, very short arguments, in some cases just one sentence. They're aphorisms.
I was going to say that.
Of your hand.
I was going to say, if people are feeling intimidated by all of these books, we should note that Greg's notebooks, especially, are very small.
The Sarah
Don't be
Manguso
impressed.
is, stocking size. It is under 100 pages.
It's a stocking stuffer. 300 arguments. Merry Christmas.
I'll give you just a quick sense of the arguments inside. Keeping a debt is a gift to the giver. It renders him generous, period.
Now there's only 299 left to read.
People congregate according to their relative levels of luck. 298 arguments on the wall.
It's like bottle.
I could write that book, says many of our listeners. All right, Greg, John, thanks for being
Thanks,
here.
Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.